Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The first time Eden truly understood what it meant to lose someone was on a quiet evening when he was just 6 years old. The air was thick with the smell of burning firewood, and the faint sound of crickets filled the silence outside. Inside their small hut, his mother, Destiny, sat beside his father, Chris, her face tense with worry. Chris had been coughing all day, but now his breath was coming in short, painful gasps. Eden clung to his mother's wrapper, confused by the fear in her eyes. Moments later, Chris let out a shuddering breath and went still. Destiny shook him, whispered his name, then screamed so loudly that the entire village must have heard. Eden didn't understand. One moment his father was there, his strong, warm hands resting on his mother's lap, and the next he was gone. The days that followed were a blur of wailing voices, the scent of dust and sweat, and the heavy weight of mourning that hung in their home. The little boy didn't cry at first, he didn't know how. He only watched as his mother wrapped her arms around herself at night, her body trembling with grief, whispering prayers that no one seemed to answer. With his father gone, their lives became harder in ways Eden couldn't fully grasp. His mother, once a woman of soft laughter and gentle hands, became quiet and withdrawn. She worked harder than before, doing everything to ensure her son didn't feel the absence of his father too deeply. She would wake up before dawn, heading to the market with a basket balanced on her head, selling whatever little she could to make sure Eden had something to eat. But no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. Some nights, Eden would pretend he wasn't hungry just so she wouldn't have to share her own portion of food with him. He would lie awake, listening to the faint sounds of her sniffles in the dark. He hated those nights the most, the ones where hunger and sadness were the only things filling the space between them. Still, Destiny never complained, never spoke of how tired she was. Instead, she would run her fingers through Eden's hair and tell him, "We'll be fine, my son. We just have to keep going." And for a while, Eden believed her. But fate had other plans. Just when Eden had begun to adjust to life without his father, tragedy struck again. He was in class when a neighbor rushed into the school compound, calling his name in a frantic voice. His heart pounded as he was led home, his little legs struggling to keep up. The moment he stepped into their yard, he knew something was terribly wrong. People stood outside their house, whispering, shaking their heads. His mother lay on the ground, surrounded by women who wept as they fanned her lifeless body. His small hands trembled as he reached out, touching her cold face. He shook her, just like she had done to his father months ago, but she didn't wake up. The world around him spun. His stomach twisted in knots. He wanted to scream, to cry, to beg someone, anyone, to wake her up. But no sound came from his lips. At 6 years old, Eden learned that life could take everything from you in the blink of an eye. He was alone now, completely, painfully alone. Eden did not remember much about the days following his mother's death, only that the house felt unbearably empty. The warmth of her voice, the soft rustling of her clothes as she moved about the small space, the gentle touch of her hands on his forehead at night, all of it was gone. The villagers came in small groups to offer their condolences, bringing bowls of food that grew cold before he could even think of eating. They whispered about him when they thought he couldn't hear, their voices heavy with pity. "Poor boy," they would say, "so young, and already he has no one." But pity did not fill his stomach, and it certainly did not ease the ache of loneliness that settled deep in his chest. Eventually, people stopped coming, and soon, even their voices faded. He was alone in the truest sense of the word. At first, he did not know what to do. Hunger gnawed at him, but the thought of stepping out of the house, of facing a world that had taken everything from him, felt impossible. He spent the first few nights curled up on the mat his mother used to sleep on, staring at the ceiling, waiting for her to call his name, but she never did. The days blurred together, and he might have withered away had it not been for Richard. Richard, whose father had also died not long before, understood the quiet suffering that Eden carried. He started coming by with small portions of food, forcing Eden to eat even when he had no appetite. When he saw that Eden had not bathed in days, he dragged him to the river, scolding him like an older brother would. Richard had his own grief to bear, but somehow he made space for Eden's too. Still, life was not kind to two boys without parents. Food did not appear out of thin air, and neither did money. Richard's mother tried her best to help, but she too struggled to keep them fed. It became clear that if they wanted to survive, they would have to work for it. Richard had a small piece of land that his father left behind, so they decided to tend to it, planting whatever crops they could. But farming was not as simple as it looked. The soil was stubborn, the sun was relentless, and their bodies, still small and underfed, ached from the effort. There were days when their hands bled from pulling weeds, and nights when hunger kept them awake despite their hard work. When the farm could not provide enough, they took on small jobs in the village, fetching water, carrying firewood, anything that would earn them a few coins. It was exhausting, but for the first time since his mother's death, Eden felt like he had a purpose. He and Richard were no longer just two abandoned boys. They were fighters, determined to carve out a life for themselves, even if the world had given up on them. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months. Eden and Richard grew accustomed to waking before dawn, their young bodies moving with the weight of responsibilities too heavy for their age. While other children ran barefoot through the village, chasing each other in laughter, they bent over their small farmland, turning the soil with aching fingers. Every morning, their stomachs grumbled in protest, but they worked anyway, driven by the fear of going to bed hungry. When the sun climbed too high, burning their backs, they wiped the sweat from their brows and continued. There was no choice, no one else to lean on, no safety net waiting to catch them if they fell. Despite the hardships, Richard never lost hope. He spoke of dreams like they were something they could reach if they just stretched their hands far enough. One day, he would say, as they sat beneath the mango tree, their legs too sore to move, "We will go to school again. We will not spend our lives like this." Eden never responded. He wanted to believe it, to hold on to something brighter than the reality they lived in, but hope felt like a luxury he could not afford. School was for children with parents, with warm meals waiting for them at home. It was not for boys who spent their days working the land, their hands rougher than their years. But Richard refused to give up. One evening, he returned home with an old leather bag clutched tightly in his hands. "This was my mother's," he said, voice quiet, almost reverent. "She got it from the city when she was still alive. It's worth a lot." Eden stared at him, confused. "So?" he asked, not understanding the significance. Richard took a deep breath. "I'm going to sell it. The money will be enough for both of us to start school again." The words hung heavy in the air. Eden opened his mouth to protest, to tell him not to give up the last thing his mother left him, but he saw the determination in Richard's eyes. There was no stopping him. And so, days later, with the money in hand, they enrolled in junior high school. It was not easy. Between classes and work, exhaustion became their constant companion, but for the first time in years, Eden allowed himself to dream. Maybe, just maybe, they could build a future that did not begin and end with survival. School was nothing like Eden remembered. The classrooms were cramped, filled with children who had spent years learning while he and Richard worked in the fields. The first few weeks were the hardest. Every lesson felt like trying to catch up to a race that had started long before he even knew it existed. The teachers spoke quickly, their chalk scratching against the blackboard, while Eden struggled to keep up, his fingers clumsy as he gripped his pencil. He often glanced at Richard, who sat beside him, brow furrowed in deep concentration. Richard had always been the one who believed in school, in education, in the idea that knowledge could change their lives. Eden wanted to believe it too, but self-doubt clung to him like a shadow. He feared that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be a step behind, always the boy who had lost too much time. But they did not have the luxury of falling behind. Every morning before school, they still worked the farm, their bodies aching with exhaustion before the first lesson even began. In the evenings, while other students went home to warm meals and soft beds, Eden and Richard took on small jobs, sweeping shops, carrying heavy baskets for market women, chopping wood for a few coins. Their fingers were often too sore to hold a pencil at night, their eyelids too heavy to stay open long enough to study. But they pushed through the exhaustion, reminding themselves why they had fought so hard to be here. Some nights, Richard would read aloud from their textbooks under the dim glow of a lantern, his voice steady despite his tiredness. Eden listened, absorbing the words even when his mind felt too worn to process them. Slowly, the lessons began to make sense. Numbers stopped looking like foreign symbols. Words that once felt like a maze untangled themselves. They were learning, slowly, painfully, but they were learning. Yet the burden of survival never eased. When it was time to move on to senior high school, the weight of reality pressed down on them again. School fees loomed like an impossible wall, and for the first time, Eden felt the fear of losing everything they had worked for. But Richard, always the one to find a way, made another sacrifice. He sold food from their farm, the very crops they had depended on for their survival. Eden knew what it meant, less food on their table, harder days ahead, but Richard had made up his mind. "We've come too far to stop now," he said simply, handing over the money to the school registrar. And just like that, they continued forward, their path uncertain, but their determination unshaken. The day Michael arrived in the village was like any other. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows on the narrow dirt roads. Eden had spent the morning helping Richard on the farm, their hands stained with soil, their clothes damp with sweat. They had grown used to the rhythm of their days, hard work, brief moments of rest, and an unspoken understanding that this was their life. But when Eden returned home that evening, he found a man standing outside his small house, his face twisted in disbelief. The man was well dressed, his shoes clean, his hands free of the calluses that Eden had long accepted as a part of himself. "You must be Chris's son," the man said, his voice carrying a weight that Eden did not yet understand. His name was Michael, and he had once served under Eden's father, back when Chris was alive and running his own business. Michael had left the village many years ago, but out of loyalty, he had come back to visit his old master, only to find that Chris was long gone. Eden did not know what to say. He had long stopped expecting anyone to speak his father's name with familiarity, let alone respect. People barely remembered Chris now, except in passing whispers about how his only son had grown up an orphan. But Michael was different. His voice held something deeper, gratitude, perhaps even guilt. "Your father changed my life," Michael admitted that evening, as they sat on the wooden bench outside. "He took me in when I had nothing. He taught me everything I know about business. When my time serving him was up, he didn't just send me away. He made sure I had enough to start my own life." Michael paused, rubbing his hands together as if trying to steady himself. "I owe him everything." Eden listened in silence. He barely remembered his father's voice, let alone the kindness Michael described. But still, something about the man's words stirred an unfamiliar feeling inside him, an ache for a past he never truly got to know. And then, just as Eden was beginning to process it all, Michael made an offer that would change everything. "Come with me to the city," he said. "Let me teach you what your father taught me. You don't have to struggle like this forever." The offer was like a door opening to a world Eden had never imagined, a world beyond the endless labor, beyond the limits of their small village. And yet, as tempting as it was, a deep unease settled in his chest. Richard. The thought of leaving his friend behind, after everything they had endured together, felt like a betrayal. Richard had always been there, through hunger, exhaustion, and the quiet moments of despair. To leave now, just when they were beginning to carve out a future, seemed unthinkable. But Richard, as always, saw things differently. "This is your chance," he said firmly when Eden hesitated. "You've worked too hard to turn this down." There was no bitterness in his voice, no resentment. Just the quiet, unwavering support that had always defined their friendship. And so, with a heavy heart and a suitcase that barely held more than a few worn clothes, Eden left the village, stepping onto a path that would lead him further away from the boy he used to be. The city was nothing like the village. It was louder, faster, and filled with people who moved as if the world belonged to them. Eden had never seen so many buildings stacked side by side, their glass windows reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. The air smelled different, thick with smoke and the scent of roasted street food. His first night in Michael's house felt surreal: soft bedding, electric lights that did not flicker like the oil lamps back home, and the quiet hum of machines he did not yet understand. But beneath the awe, there was also unease. The life he had known, the struggles he had faced with Richard, felt like they belonged to another person. Here, no one knew him as the orphaned boy who worked on a farm. No one whispered about his past. He was simply Eden, a young man learning a trade, trying to find his place in a world that had once seemed so far away. Michael was a strict but patient teacher. He owned a thriving business, and every morning Eden followed him to his shop, watching and learning. The work was different from anything he had done before. There were no heavy baskets to carry, no calloused hands digging into dry soil. Instead, there were numbers to memorize, customers to handle, and deals to negotiate. At first, Eden struggled. The city people spoke quickly, their words smooth and confident, while he often hesitated, afraid of making mistakes. But Michael did not allow him to shrink under pressure. "Your father built something from nothing," he reminded Eden one evening as they sat in the office. "That same strength is in you." Slowly, Eden began to adapt. He learned how to bargain, how to read people's intentions, how to turn a simple sale into a lasting connection, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to stability. But even as he settled into this new life, there was a part of him that felt incomplete. Letters from Richard were few and far between, their words growing shorter with time. Eden often meant to write back, to ask how life was treating his old friend, but he always found an excuse to put it off. The days turned into months, and then years. He became immersed in the world Michael had introduced him to, climbing his way up in the business. He had money now, respect, a future that once seemed impossible. But what he did not realize, what he could not yet see, was that with every step forward, he was leaving behind more than just his past. He was leaving behind the very foundation of who he was. And one day, when he finally looked back, he would find that the world he once called home had kept moving without him. Years passed, and the boy who once struggled to hold a pencil had become a man who signed contracts with a steady hand. Eden had built something for himself in the city, something his younger self could have never imagined. He owned a business now, smaller than Michael's, but growing steadily. His days were filled with meetings, calculations, and the endless demands of success. There were nights when he barely slept, when his mind raced with figures and plans, but he no longer felt the hunger that once gnawed at his ribs. He had everything he had once longed for: money, comfort, and the respect of the people around him. And yet something deep inside him felt hollow, as if a part of him had been left behind in the village. It was an ache he ignored, pushing it aside with every deal he made, every step he took further into the life he had built. Richard's name had become a distant memory, something Eden only thought of in rare moments of silence. The letters had stopped long ago, fading into the past like footprints washed away by the tide. He told himself it was natural. People grew apart. Life moved on. But every now and then, he wondered what had happened to the friend who once gave up everything so they could go to school. Did Richard still work the land, his hands deep in the soil they had once tilled together? Did he ever resent Eden for leaving? These questions never had answers, and so Eden buried them beneath the weight of his new world. When he married, he convinced himself he had fully moved forward. His wife was beautiful and from a respectable family, and together they had a daughter. But from the moment she was born, he felt something slipping, his hold on the life he had fought for beginning to crack. His daughter, Maya, was nothing like the child he had imagined raising. She was reckless, wild, unbothered by the discipline he tried to instill in her. While he spent his youth clawing his way out of poverty, she grew up with wealth handed to her. She did not understand struggle, did not fear consequences. No matter how many times he scolded her, tried to shape her into someone he could be proud of, she resisted. It was as if she lived only to defy him. And as the years passed, that hollow feeling inside him grew stronger, deepening with every mistake she made, every headline that bore his family name in shame. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, drowning in frustration, he found himself staring at an old, crumpled piece of paper, one of the last letters Richard had sent before they lost touch. The words were faded, but the message was clear. "I hope you haven't forgotten where we started, my friend." For the first time in years, Eden allowed himself to wonder, had he? Had he truly left his past behind, or had he simply abandoned the only person who had ever stood by him? Eden had always believed that success would bring him peace, that if he worked hard enough, earned enough, built enough, he would finally feel whole. But as he sat in his office that evening, staring at the faded letter in his hands, he felt further from that peace than ever before. The city, once a symbol of opportunity and escape, now felt suffocating. His own home had become a place of conflict, where his daughter's reckless behavior eroded whatever patience he had left. The wealth he once saw as a prize now felt like a curse, separating him from the man he used to be. He had convinced himself that cutting ties with the past had been necessary, that looking back would only slow him down. But the weight of all he had left behind was catching up with him. For the first time in years, he wondered if the path he had taken had truly led him somewhere better, or if he had simply lost himself along the way. Far away from the noise of the city, Richard's life had unfolded in a different way. He had remained in the village, working the same land they once shared. The years had carved lines into his face, not from stress over business deals, but from days spent under the scorching sun, hands roughened by labor. He had married, built a home, and raised a daughter with quiet determination. Unlike Eden, Richard never chased wealth or status. His happiness came from simpler things: the laughter of his child, the satisfaction of a good harvest, the knowledge that he had done right by those he loved. But that did not mean life had been kind to him. His mother's long illness had drained what little savings he had, and when she finally passed, the burden of survival fell on him alone. He had no mentor to lift him out of hardship, no lucky opportunity to change his fate. And yet, despite all the struggles, he had never felt abandoned until Eden stopped writing. When Richard heard that Eden had returned to the village for a brief visit, he felt a strange mix of emotions. He did not expect anything from his old friend, but a part of him had always hoped that Eden would remember. Remember the boy who had shared his hunger, his dreams. Remember the sacrifices that made their journey possible. But when they finally met, standing face to face for the first time in years, Richard saw the truth written in Eden's eyes. He was a stranger now. The bond they had once shared had been worn away by time, by distance, by choices that had led them in opposite directions. And though they exchanged polite words, though they spoke of their children and the years that had passed, there was an unspoken truth lingering between them. Some friendships, no matter how deep, do not survive the weight of time and silence. As Eden left the village once more, Richard watched him go, realizing that the boy he once called a brother had become nothing more than a man passing through. Eden returned to the city with an emptiness he could not shake. The village had felt smaller than he remembered, as if time had stripped it of the significance it once held in his life. Seeing Richard again had been unsettling, not because his old friend had changed, but because he had not. Richard still carried himself with the same quiet strength, still lived with the same sense of purpose that had once driven them both. But Eden could not ignore the distance between them, the way their conversation had felt forced, as if they were two men speaking through the ghosts of their younger selves. He had expected warmth, a familiar ease, but instead he had been met with something closer to resignation. It was not anger or bitterness, it was worse. It was indifference, the kind that comes when a person finally accepts that someone they once cherished is no longer a part of their life. That realization clung to Eden long after he left, making the city feel colder than before. At home, things were unraveling. His daughter, Maya, had grown more reckless, slipping further from his grasp with each passing day. The wealth that was meant to give her security had only made her careless. She moved through life without caution, as if nothing could touch her. News of her misdeeds reached him in whispers and headlines, disrespecting elders, causing trouble at school, indulging in excess without thought for consequences. Eden tried to control her, to discipline her the way his father once disciplined him, but she met his authority with defiance. She had never known struggle, never tasted the bitterness of hunger or the desperation of survival. To her, life was not something to fight for, it was something to waste. And the more Eden tried to pull her back, the more she slipped through his fingers, like water refusing to be held. He saw the disappointment in his wife's eyes, the silent accusation that he had failed as a father. But deep down, what terrified him most was the thought that maybe Maya was simply a reflection of what he had become, a person who had lost sight of what truly mattered. Meanwhile, far away from the turmoil of Eden's life, Richard's daughter had grown into a woman he could be proud of. Unlike Maya, she had inherited her father's quiet resilience, his unwavering sense of duty. From the moment she was old enough to understand her father's sacrifices, she had vowed to make them worth something. She had studied hard, pushed herself beyond what was expected, and worked relentlessly to become a nurse. And now, as she stood in a hospital room, tending to patients with the same care her father had once shown her, she felt the weight of everything he had given up for her. She had not grown up with luxury, but she had grown up with love, with the steady hands of a father who had never abandoned her, who had never let hardship make him bitter. And because of that, she had become someone who could stand tall, someone who could give back. The contrast between Richard's child and Eden's could not have been starker. One had built a life on gratitude, while the other had squandered the privileges handed to her, and soon Eden would be forced to face the consequences of the choices he had made, not just for himself, but for the family he had neglected to truly understand. Eden sat alone in his office, the city lights flickering through the large glass window behind him. The world outside moved as it always did, fast, relentless, uncaring. But inside, time felt unbearably slow. The silence pressed against him, heavy with the weight of his failures. He had spent his life chasing a dream, believing that wealth and success would erase the pain of his past. Yet here he was, a man who had everything and nothing all at once. His business, once thriving, had begun to crumble under the weight of poor decisions and misplaced trust. Investors were withdrawing, debts were mounting, and for the first time in years, he felt the same fear he had known as a boy, the fear of losing everything. But worse than that was the realization that he had already lost what truly mattered. Maya was no longer just reckless, she was spiraling. She no longer hid her disregard for him, no longer cared about the shame she brought to his name. It was as if she was determined to punish him for something he could not fully understand. And perhaps she had every right to. One evening, in a moment of desperation, Eden did something he had not done in years. He returned to the village, not as a successful man visiting his past, but as a broken man seeking answers. He did not know what he expected when he arrived at Richard's home, but the sight that met him made his chest tighten. Richard's house was modest, and nothing like the towering buildings Eden had grown accustomed to, but it was warm, filled with laughter and the scent of home-cooked food. He saw Richard's daughter seated beside her father, her presence exuding the quiet dignity of someone who had worked for everything she had. The sight of them together made something twist inside him: envy, regret, longing for something he had let slip through his fingers. When Richard finally stepped outside to meet him, there was no anger in his gaze, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that cut deeper than words ever could. "You never look back, Eden," Richard said simply, his voice steady but firm. "You had a choice, and you chose yourself." The words stung because they were true. Eden had told himself that leaving the village was necessary, that sacrificing his old life was the price of success. But standing here in front of the man who had once been like a brother to him, he saw the truth he had spent years avoiding. He had not just abandoned his past, he had abandoned the people who had made it possible for him to rise. As Eden prepared to leave, he looked one last time at Richard and his daughter. They did not have wealth, yet they had something far greater: love, unity, the kind of peace that money could never buy. It was something Eden had spent his entire life trying to attain, only to realize too late that he had been searching in the wrong place. He returned to the city a changed man, but change did not undo the past. His business collapsed, and Maya strayed even further, her actions growing more reckless, more destructive. He had spent years neglecting the values that could have saved her, and now he was paying the price. Richard, on the other hand, watched his daughter flourish, knowing that though life had not been easy, he had given her something no amount of money could replace: a foundation built on love, sacrifice, and the understanding that true success was never about wealth, but about the lives we choose to nurture. As the years passed, Eden finally understood the depth of his mistakes. But understanding came too late, and regret became the only thing he had left. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.